Hey guys, Chris here with GoodOldGamer. So today I want to talk to you guys about the GTX 1080Ti and why this card is such an anomaly. This card really only has one other precedent in the entire history of GPUs to be compared with. So a lot of you guys keep mentioning, I want to upgrade my 1080Ti. Nothing out there gives me an option. Well, that's because, like I just said, that card was technically an anomaly. So you got a lot more performance than you should have last generation at a much more reasonable price than it probably should have been. So let's go ahead and take a look at why Nvidia today is still struggling to compete against its GTX 1080Ti. Alright, so I'm starting off over here on a non-tech, and this is just to kind of sum up the pre-2006 mentality of GPUs. Essentially, they don't even want to waste their time talking about $500 video cards. Anything above $500 in that time frame and beforehand was pretty much relegated to being irrelevant. It's because they weren't worth it and nobody recommended them. You could typically buy $399 or less GPUs and overclock them to the same performance. So these cards were pretty much looked at as novelties for people that just wanted to burn money. So pretty much 2006 on back, nobody was recommending anything over $500. Now, this all changed with the first anomaly, and that was the Geforce 8800 GTX. This card came out at $599, and some sources have it at $649, so somewhere between $600 and $650, back in November 2006. So this card right here was the first GPU that anybody could recommend above that $500 price point, or more likely above $399, because typically nobody even recommended $499 cards prior to this. This card was actually so far ahead of its time that it remained the top performer even in comparison to Nvidia's 9800 GTX, which they tried to replace it with. In most benchmarks, typically the 8800 GTX still won. Now, that's the reason why the 9800 GTX had to be priced so low. It cost them a lot less to make, so Nvidia said, hey, let's just go ahead and make it the next generation. Sounds kind of familiar to some of the shenanigans that we see here going on today. Now, the next time that Nvidia tried launching a graphics card, a real graphics card launch, that was with the GTX 1080. And this came out about 2 years later, and they were shooting for $649, basically the same price. However, that card was made stupid just days later when ATI released the 4870. So nobody recommended the GTX 280. Instead, the 4870 became the mainstream GPU that pretty much everybody recommended for the vast majority of users out there, effectively making this card irrelevant, and the prices dropped almost immediately to compete. Now, following up the 4870, ATI/AMD actually were first out the next generation, and out they were. I mean, this came out very, very early compared to its Fermi competition, and it was very reasonably priced while delivering ridiculous amounts of performance. Nvidia had no choice. They couldn't actually get their full die out. They had to cut down their GF100 all the way down to 480 CUDA cores. Kind of made sense because it was the GTX 480, so that kind of worked out for them a little bit, I suppose. But they had to price it at $499 because it was not significantly faster than the 5870, even though it was a much larger die, produced tons of heat, and honestly was the worst GPU probably ever produced. This made Vega look like a freaking winner, because even Vega came out and they were able to utilize all of its FP32 cores, so they could actually deliver the full chip, unlike the GTX 480. Next up was the GTX 580, and once again, this actually wasn't too bad. They did have a node shrink, so they were able to get thermals and stuff under control, and finally deliver the entire Fermi chip. But they stuck with the $499 price tag because they still had stiff competition from ATI/AMD, and they needed to buy back a little bit of goodwill from the consumers. And then this happened. But anyway, we're just looking at numbers here. So the GTX 680 came out, once again, $499, so they weren't shooting for some top tier price. However, this was not the top tier silicon. This was basically the mid-range card that they were able to get outperforming the GTX 580 by a little bit. Let's see if we can find it on here. So this has it being 19% slower, so it was a little bit faster. The main reason why they could get away with this is because it was basically on par with what AMD had out at the time. Now, as we know, the 7970 has aged infinitely better than the GTX 1080, but at the time, you can't predict the future like that. So at the time, they were basically neck and neck, and AMD was charging $549 for this card. So coming out at $499, this actually seemed somewhat reasonable. But this is when everything changed. Instead of launching the best GPU that NVIDIA could, instead, they focused on prices and performance. So that became the metric. And this is really when that all changed. And this is what we're really arguing about here today a lot. But once again, we can see $499 was the card at the high end, and realistically, most people got the $399 GTX 670 because it performed almost the same as this card, and it was $100 less. Doesn't that sound familiar? NVIDIA finally launched their GK 110, which is the big chip for the Kepler architecture. This is basically what should have been the 780 to begin with, except they did cut down on the FP32 cores here. Once again, NVIDIA was shooting for the $649 price point. This is what they're going for. They figured, hey, let's go for that. However, just a couple months later, AMD launched the R9 290. Yes, there was the 290X, but honestly, this card at $399 made every single GPU above it look stupid, because it was within a few percentage points of the 780 Ti, which launched just a few days later and came in at $699. Every GPU above this, including the R9 290X and the Titan Black, all looked stupid next to this $399 GPU. So once again, graphics cards, $399, that was basically where everybody was recommending you spend your money. Now, due to crypto mining, that wasn't really the case, and there was a lot of issues there, but that was outside of the control of everybody. Now, moving on to the next flagship, a lot of people think that the GTX 980 made a lot of sense. This was a good card. This was a big deal back then. Well, not really. I mean, this came out June 2nd, 2015. It was $649. Now, granted, this was a card that performed really well at the time and seemed like a decent deal, except the problem was most people already had a Geforce GTX 970 or like an R9 390 or something like that, because these cards were actually really cheap. For an X70 class card, it came in at $329. So right off the bat, you were getting a really good value here. So the GTX 980 Ti, it just didn't make a lot of sense for most people, and it made even worse sense when you look at this. On June 10th, 2016, so basically a year later, you get the same performance at $379. So that's very short-lived for the 980 Ti. And while many people really like the GTX 1070, I'm sure many of you guys actually own this card. It has more memory and it's faster for $200 to $250 less. This was absolutely great. And this is not something out of the ordinary. I mean, that's typically what we saw generation to generation. 780 Ti performance at the 970, which was $329 at launch. So yeah, this was right in line with what we were all expecting. However, the GTX 1080, which actually launched at $699 with its Founders Edition price, this card nobody recommended. It cost too much, and honestly, the performance gains, while there, it was 30% faster than the 980 Ti. So, I mean, it's a pretty good bit ahead, but still, at that price point, it didn't make a lot of sense. And then a few months later, NVIDIA finally dropped the ball, and that was the GeForce GTX 1080 Ti. This bad boy has nearly twice the memory from the card that it's replacing, coming in at 11 gigabytes, which the only reason why they had to do this is because they were basically competing against their own Titan X, which had 12 gigabytes. So if this also had 12 gigabytes of memory, they would have just really pissed off a lot of Titan owners. This gave Titan owners a little bit of a leg to stand on, saying, yeah, you know, I spent like $400 or $500 more, but I got that gigabyte of memory. Gave them a little bit of ground there. Now, going to the GTX 1080 Ti review, we can see that compared to the GTX 980 that it replaced, it's nearly twice as fast while costing only $50 more. So this is an absolutely mammoth increase. This is a jump like we really hadn't seen in a really, really long time. Not from the ye olden days when 100% increases were normal. In modern times, this hasn't happened in a very long time. So this was a gigantic leap beyond anything anybody could have imagined. And that's why NVIDIA, even today, is struggling to compete with the GTX 1080 Ti. It was actually too good for what it was. So this is from Techspot's RTX 2080 review. So we can see the 2080 versus the GTX 1080 Ti at launch. So these numbers would be a little bit higher here today, but 1% faster at 1440p and 1% faster at 4K. Moving on over to their RTX 2080 Super review, compared to the 2080, which was about 1% faster. Let's say even if it was 3 or 4% faster now, even the Super is only 5% faster at 4K and 6% faster at 1440p, meaning the RTX 2080 Super is only 10% faster than the GTX 1080 Ti in most cases. And this really paints things in perspective. This is the only time that a card over $499 was ever recommended besides the GeForce 8800 GTX. Every other card that attempted that price point was pretty much scoffed at, laughed at, and pushed aside as being irrelevant. This has only happened twice in all of GPU history that a video card was actually worth more than $499. And this is due to the fact that the performance gain was absolutely massive over its predecessor in a way that just was atypical from the time. Both the 1080 Ti and 8800 GTX offered such a significant performance gain that it was going to last a long, long time. Now you might be asking yourself, why would NVIDIA put out such a powerful graphics card at such a reasonable price? I mean, now granted, $699 is not a reasonable price. It is a lot of money, but for the performance you were getting relative to the performance that it was basically compared to, this was not bad. This was actually a very, very good deal. You're getting about twice the performance for $50 more. And essentially, this all came down to AMD. AMD is the reason why the GTX 1080 Ti existed, why it was so powerful. It's because of AMD's marketing of their upcoming Vega architecture. And even I fell prey to this way back when. If you take a look, I'm playing some of their old footage, their old promos for the Vega cards. The number 2X comes up a lot. And everything that they were saying sounded really good and plausible. Now, as we know, a lot of these features didn't actually end up working or working right. And obviously the card did not quite get to that level, but they were announcing to the world that they were expecting 2 times performance gains. They were ambiguous about it, so nobody knew 2 times from what, but everybody assumed either 2 times faster than Polaris or 2 times faster from the old Fury architecture. You could kind of take either one there, and that was still spelling out an extremely competitive product. So the main reason why the GTX 1080 Ti even exists is because AMD basically said we're going to have twice as fast as either our Fury cards or our Polaris cards, which if you look at a RX 480 and you times it by 2 in linear scaling, it basically hits the 1080 Ti. So basically, NVIDIA took AMD at their word and they produced a card that was twice as fast. AMD, however, simply did not, and they weren't able to do that. It was a very ambitious goal for them, and obviously they couldn't quite get there. Well, alrighty guys, that's it. That's the history of graphics cards. The GTX 1080 Ti is an anomaly. It's only happened once before, and like I said, that was the 8800 GTX at that $600 to $650 price tag that anybody actually recommended such a high-priced graphics card. Every other generation, $399 or $499, was typically the absolute maximum that anybody ever recommended for a graphics card. And this is part of the reason why I say that that price point, even today, is the most important price point out there. All the other price points above that are irrelevant. And for everybody out there thinking that graphics cards in those price points are going to typically be worth it because you really got a good deal from the GTX 1080 Ti, you need to take a step back and realize that's not the case. That is the oddity. That is not going to be the average. The RTX 2080 Ti is only 30% faster than the 1080 Ti. It's barely faster. Even if that came out at the same $699 price point, that is barely a generational upgrade in and of itself. 30% is basically the bare minimum that you can consider to be a generational upgrade. Or at the very least, that's what we used to consider the bare minimum for a generational upgrade. So even at $699, the 2080 Ti is barely an upgrade. And what's crazy is NVIDIA said screw it, and they just started charging insane amounts of money, almost double the amount of money for that card for such a minuscule increase in price. And this is the reason why their numbers have been hurting. They haven't been selling graphics cards. Now, whether or not it cost NVIDIA too much money to make these, and as I've said before, it's not our problem as the customer to shoulder their R&D costs or higher development costs or whatever. It's up to them to deliver the performance, and then we reward them by upgrading our current products. Now, upgrading from the GTX 1080 Ti to anything right now is dumb. There is no reason for it. And like I said, the main reason for that is the 1080 Ti was too good. It was so good that AMD themselves couldn't match that level of performance that even they were going ahead saying that they were going to produce. Honestly, that's the reason why I think it came in at $699 as well, because they knew that that would absolutely crush whatever AMD would be able to do, because NVIDIA knows how expensive HBM2 is, because they use them on their P100 chips. And of course, Vega was going to be using HBM2. So they can kind of figure out that that card was going to be relatively expensive to produce. So it was an excellent marketing move. It was a great strategy by NVIDIA. And by doing so, by preempting Navi, because AMD was shooting their mouth off on something that they could not do, basically NVIDIA just stomped that generation out. And you, me, and everybody, we had the opportunity to buy something basically half a generation ahead of its time, essentially. They preempted the entire Vega launch with that card, and that's the reason why the Vega launch went down as badly as it did. It wasn't a bad card. Vega was just fine. It's just AMD overhyped things too much. NVIDIA believed them, and then they delivered on a card that AMD simply just could not make. It was outside of the realm of their possibilities, but NVIDIA could do it. Well, alrighty guys, that's the reason why the GTX 1080 Ti is so good. And this is the reason why you're not going to be upgrading this entire generation. Even the 2080 Ti looks stupid next to it, because it costs twice as much and you're only gaining 30% more performance. There's a lot of people out there that want more performance. I get that. This generation, from both sides thus far, is not really delivering. Now, we don't have a lot of information on Navi 20, so I can't really speculate as to what's going to happen. But at the very least, they do have the capabilities or the possibility of competing and possibly even beating the RTX 2080 Ti and possibly even competing with whatever is going to be replacing the 2080 Ti. It just depends on how much maturity that they have in the 7nm node, depending on how big of a die they want to make, whether or not they decide to use HBM, but it's going to be expensive. The GPU market had those anomalies a few times, like I said, twice, only twice, where graphics cards above the $499 mark actually ever made sense. But trust me, both manufacturers are going to be pushing that $1,000 barrier as hard as they can, because they know that there are people out there that want to spend in that particular price bracket. Now, the $399 to $499 price point, that's the battleground. That's where the vast majority of higher-end GPUs will be sold. As I mentioned, cards above $499 typically were not really ever recommended to gamers. Only those two instances were they. So if you want cards that are that expensive, both companies will deliver more expensive and more powerful cards to you as time goes on. However, like I said, that tier is going to continue to grow. Things are going to continue to get more expensive, while the $399, $499, and below price points will continue to be the battlegrounds for the vast majority of gamers. So if you have a GTX 1080 Ti, just hold on to it, wait till next generation, wait till Navi 20 at the very least, and see what there is. You just happen to buy the Anomaly graphics card that just happened to be way too cheap for the performance that it was delivering. So good on you. You hit the lottery. It's just like if you bought an 8800 GTX way back when in 2006. That thing lasted forever because it was so powerful. Well, alrighty guys, I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on this, so please leave a comment in the comment section below. If you like this video, please hit that like button, please subscribe, please share with friends, that really does help me out. If you want to help support the channel for as little as $1 a month, you can become a patron over on Patreon. That goes ahead and helps me get tech on hand so I can do more hands-on reviews. And that's all I have for today, and I will catch you guys in the next video.